Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
No te metas, no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta.
No te metas, no te metas.
Mi tierra linda, mi Cuba mía, mi bandera se respeta.
No te metas.
De La Habana pa' Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
Greetings, everybody. Greetings. Thank you so much for joining us. Greetings to our comrade Deborah from the PIDC and JAAC. We see you. Good morning, Sam. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us this afternoon on Weekly Pan-African News. We are the All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter, and this is our weekly video show, Weekly Pan-African News. We started this program over a year ago at the beginning of the pandemic in order to reach our people. We've been doing it every single week since then. My name is Onya Zanwu. This is my comrade Monica. We are both members of the New Mexico chapter of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary, pan-African socialist mass political party based in Africa, founded in Africa over 50 years ago by one Kwame Nkrumah. For folks that don't know, Kwame Nkrumah was the first democratically elected president of Ghana after Ghana gained its independence from British colonialism. And after Ghana gained its independence from British colonialism, Kwame Nkrumah declared that the independence of Ghana was meaningless, of the total liberation and unification of Africa. He called for the formation of our organization, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and our political objective is that unified, socialist, and liberated in Africa. So thank you so much for joining us. As I said, I'm Onyesamu. I am your very sleepy host. Monica is also very sleepy. I'm just going to be upfront. It's been a long day. So if it's like a little bit weird, that's what it is. We're both running on probably 2-3 hours of sleep. So that's what's happening. But for frequent watchers of the show, you know that we always start off with a couple of things. The introduction that I just did, but also 2 other things. First off, we always call in an African ancestor. And the reason why we call in an African ancestor is because we understand as revolutionary African people, as members of a revolutionary Pan-African organization, that we are just building upon the contributions of many, many Africans that struggled and fought before us. We would not be here speaking to you without the contributions and sacrifices of our African ancestors for the liberation of our people and of Africa as a whole. And so we'd be remiss as revolutionary African people, as revolutionary African women, if we did not acknowledge the Africans that sacrificed in order for us to do this work. Today, the ancestor is actually someone who has not passed away. The ancestor is someone who is still living to this day, someone who dedicated her life to the struggle for African liberation, someone who was persecuted by this empire for struggling for her people's liberation. That person is Assata Shakur. We're calling her in today because her birthday is actually tomorrow. Her birthday is tomorrow, so happy birthday, Assata. But first, she probably needs no introduction, but I'm just going to break it down. She was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was a member of the Black Liberation Army. She fought side by side with revolutionary African people for the liberation of our people on this territory. And they worked to connect the struggles of African people in the United States to the struggles of African and oppressed peoples all over the world. She, of course, famously wrote the biography of Assata Shakur, which has radicalized generations of African people, particularly African women and girls, all across the world. She was framed by the U.S. Empire, by the United States, for the murder of a Jersey State trooper. She was incarcerated and tortured by that same United States Empire. But she broke out, y'all. Her comrades organized and liberated her and carried her to safety to Cuba, where she remains to this day in the revolutionary nation of Cuba under their protection. The United States government has a very high bounty on her head that was increased, actually, by the very first African president, Barack Obama. But Cuba, regardless, has never given her up and will never give her up. And so Assata is living free and safe on that revolutionary island, despite that island being consistently attacked by the United States. So we want to say happy birthday, Assata Shakur. Thank you so much for your contributions to the liberation of our people. May you live a long, free life in Cuba, and may all the United States attacks on Cuba end. The other thing that we always do at the beginning of every show is that we always do a land acknowledgement. We are speaking to y'all from occupied Tiwa territory, also known as the city of Albuquerque. Albuquerque is actually the name of some Spanish colonizers that came here and stole land and probably killed indigenous people. So we don't call it Albuquerque, we call it occupied Tiwa territory, because the Tiwa Nation is the rightful owner of the land that we are sitting on. The entire Western Hemisphere is stolen indigenous land, just like all of Africa was stolen from Africans, just like Palestine was stolen from Palestinians, just like Australia was stolen from indigenous Australian people. So all over the world, indigenous people are fighting for their land back. And so when we do a land acknowledgement, we are not just saying it to say it. We are saying it because we understand that once something has stolen, it will remain stolen until it's given back to its rightful owner, period. This land was taken. This land must be returned. Return all land to indigenous peoples all over the world, from Africa to Palestine to Turtle Island. So that's the land acknowledgement. So moving on, speaking of Cuba, we want to have like a little bit of a world geo monologue for y'all, because Cuba, as we speak, is currently being attacked by the U.S. empire. This is actually nothing new. It's just in the news cycle now, and so a lot of people are talking about it in very frustrating ways. So for folks that are not aware, there were protests on the island of Cuba, scattered across the island. Their size was like drastically, what's the word? Like the U.S. exaggerated the size of the protest, but the protest did happen in Cuba. And the reason why the protest happened in Cuba is because at the height of the pandemic last year, the Trump administration escalated the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And the escalation of that blockade meant that Cubans were suddenly cut off from access to money from their families in the United States. They were suddenly cut off from access, or faced increased cut-off access to medicine, to food, and to fuel. So at the height of the pandemic, the Trump administration escalated the blockade and increased the suffering on the Cuban people. At the same time as Trump did that, Cuba was sending doctors all around the world. Cuba was fighting COVID all around the world, but the people on the island were suffering. And so now we're at this point where they've been denied access to sufficient food, where they've been denied access to sufficient resources, and where they are very, very, very frustrated and COVID cases are going up on the island. So a combination of those factors led to some protests in Cuba in the last week. But when we see the coverage in the United States, we see people saying that the Cuban people are seeking the overthrow of their socialist revolution. The Cuban people are seeking the overthrow of their government. The United States is using the discontent that it created in Cuba to attempt to justify regime change on the island. But like I just said, the reason why, and the protests are being manipulated. The anger of the Cuban people is being manipulated by imperialism. But it's important to understand that there are people in the streets in Cuba who are marching because they're dissatisfied, who are marching because they faced scarcity and lack. That does not mean they want to overthrow the revolution. It just means that the blockade is making them suffer and they're expressing that. But the United States is attempting to manipulate that discontent in order to attack the Cuban revolution. And so people in the United States, unfortunately, are falling straight into it. So it's important to acknowledge that the protests are legitimate because we have to understand the context of why they're happening. And the context of why they're happening is the U.S. blockade on Cuba and the sanctions being made worse at the height of the pandemic. The other thing to really understand about Cuba is that there's like 24/7 coverage of these scattered and pretty small protests in Cuba on channels like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, New York Times. They're presenting it as like mass discontent. They're presenting it as, again, the Cuban people want to overthrow the revolution because the United States is interested in ending the Cuban revolution. That's why they're doing that. The United States is attempting to manipulate the discontent of the Cuban people that, again, the United States created in order to attack the Cuban revolution. So now we have all these mainstream media channels pushing that narrative, not talking about the blockade. I've watched so many news reports on what's happening in Cuba where they're talking about shortages of food and fuel, but they don't talk about the blockade on CNN, on the New York Times, or whatever. So they're not talking about how we got here. They're only talking about the protests. They're exaggerating the size of the protests. And the end result is that there's a lot of discourse in the United States now, even among leftists, where people are saying, oh, well, maybe Cuba needs humanitarian intervention. Oh, well, maybe Cuba needs a different change or a different kind of government. But that is incorrect, y'all. What Cuba needs, point blank period, is the end of the U.S. blockade. They don't need the overthrowing of the revolution. They don't need their president to step down. They need the U.S. to stop blockading them so they can access food, medicine, and fuel, period. What people need to understand is that the Cuban Revolution was not the act of a single man. It was not Fidel Castro single-handedly leading the Cuban people to revolution. The Cuban Revolution was an act of the entire Cuban population. They built it from the ground up. They transformed the society into a socialist one from the ground up. They fought and sacrificed and bled and died for the socialism that exists on the island right now. They do not want it to go. They just want access to food and economic opportunity and fuel and medicine during a pandemic. And so when you hear these news reports on Cuba in the United States, when you hear people on CNN or on Fox News or on MSNBC saying the Cuban people want the overthrow of their government, you have to think critically. You have to look at how we got here, which is, again, the blockade imposed by the United States. And you have to understand that if you want to help the people in Cuba, if you want to show up for the masses of Cuban people, then you, living in the belly of the beast, must pressure the U.S. government to end the blockade, period. It is not on you to make your criticisms of the Cuban government at this point. Absolutely not. It is not on you to spread the narrative that the Cuban people want to overthrow the revolution. That is not what you do right now. What you do right now is call for the end of the U.S. blockade on Cuba, period. The last thing I want to say about this is that, like I said, the protests in Cuba are legitimate. There are people in the streets of Cuba who have legitimate grievances. They are scattered. They are not as large as they're being represented, but they do exist. But they are getting 24/7 coverage in U.S. media. At the same time, there have been 3 straight years of continuous protests in Haiti. There has been a year of continuous protests in Colombia. All of these nations that have these U.S.-backed leaders that are oppressing their people, that are funded by the U.S. government, like Duque in Haiti, like Moise Jovenel until he got ICE last week, who are being backed by the U.S., when the people in those places rise up against those U.S.-backed leaders, it's not shown on the U.S. media. Yesterday, I read a news story about how Cuban Americans took over a highway in Miami calling for U.S. intervention in Cuba, calling for so-called humanitarian intervention. What folks may not know is that the governor of Florida passed a law saying it was illegal. It was an act of terrorism to take over a highway. But when those Cuban Americans took over that highway in Miami, calling for U.S. intervention, guess what the cops in Florida did? Nothing. Nothing. When Black Lives Matter protesters last summer took the same highway, they passed a law in Florida saying that drivers could run them over with no consequences. When Cuban Americans take the same highway, the police protect them. What does that tell you? The news won't cover protests in U.S.-backed against U.S.-backed dictators in Haiti and Colombia, but the news will cover scattered protests in Cuba. The state of Florida will attack Black Lives Matter protesters for taking a highway, and that same state will turn around and protect Cuban Americans calling for U.S. intervention in Cuba. What does that tell you? It tells you that the U.S. is intentionally manipulating the discontent that they created in Cuba to justify overthrowing the Cuban Revolution. And so you have to be very, very, very careful about how you talk about those protests and about sharing the full context of why they're happening. Be extremely careful. I have seen too many leftists this week, people that call themselves socialists or anarchists or whatever, running their mouths about Cuba, using this opportunity of U.S. imperialist attacks on Cuba to make their criticisms of the Cuban government. Now is not the time. Look at my face. Now is not the time. Now is the time to say, end the blockade. If you care about Cuban people, if you see them protesting and you want to help, then you call for your government to end that blockade so they can eat. Period. So that's all I want to say about that. Anyway, so that was World Geo Update, very brief, kind of scattered because I'm sleepy, but hopefully it was clear. And next, the other thing we do on the show every single episode is that we have a political education segment. You are not going to go to an AAPRP event anywhere in the world without getting some aspect of political education. This show is no exception. This week, we actually have another interview in our interview series that I'm very, very excited about. We have our comrade Jamilah Bourdon, who is a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. Jamilah and I organized in the Oregon chapter of the AAPRP, and Jamilah is now a cadre leading her own work study circle, the Cadre Work Study Circle out of New York. So Jamilah, if you can hear me, I welcome you to join us so we can commence the interview.
Greetings. Can
Hello,
you see?
hello.
Right.
Hi, Jamilah.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying, because there's a both-sidedness on the issue of Cuba, and a lot of people who support Bernie Sanders, for instance, people need to recognize that Bernie Sanders actually supported the extradition of Assata Shakur.
Yeah.
So that is something we need to recognize and understand. And I wanted to say, for the both of you saying you got 2 to 4 hours of sleep, the revolution is keeping us all awake. This work is keeping us all awake despite the amount of sleep we got, because I've definitely been there, and this work is so important to all of us. And I think you are doing excellent. And I think it's that plug. The revolution is that plug. It's that battery. So I just wanted to say that, because I think y'all are excellent. And as you said, we did organize together in Oregon, and it was a bittersweet moment for all of us to leave. But I know we were going to do that work wherever we went. So.
Also, Oregon is terrible. The people there are great. So, woo, that place is terrible. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Jamilah. We got a series of questions for you to get deep into the organizing you do for the liberation of our people. And the first question we have for you is, who is Jamilah Bourdon? What brought you into the organizing and into the AAPRP?
So I had to go way back. And I think the pivotal moment in which helped me come to this realization that capitalism was inhumane was when I was about 9 or 10. And it was the Iran-Contra hearings. And my mother would have it on in the kitchen, and she'd be making food or whatever. And I'm like, what is this? Something about it doesn't sit right with me. And so I had to develop this, and I had a burgeoning anti-capitalist analysis. It wasn't developed, obviously, at a preteen child age. But then I started getting into punk rock. And there was a lot of like anti-capitalist, like anti-patriarchal, like anarchist punk rock, socialist punk rock. So I started listening to that. And then I started studying anarchism, socialism, Marxism, etc. And then my analysis still wasn't fine-tuned being a teenager. I was like, whatever. And then I started really studying a little bit more world history. I was an older teenager in my 20s. I started doing activism and organizing, hanging out with international socialists, ISO folks, doing school walkouts, all kind of stuff like that. And then I joined an African-led organization in my later years. How old am I? I'm going to be 45. So I've had a lot of time to do this work. And in the midst of that, I met Ajamu Umi, who's also been on this program. And so we met, obviously, I'm coming from New York. I'm back on the East Coast, but lived in Portland, Oregon. And so we met and we started doing a lot of community defense stuff. And so I know he wrote a book about community defense, but we joined this, it was a collective of folks under the African or Black Working Group. And so we did a community defense project called Occupy Northeast. So there was the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy, et cetera. But we did Occupy Northeast as in Northeast Portland. And we started doing housing defense and fighting foreclosures. And so that was a huge thing. I went to an African Liberation Day with the Jamu and my life was changed. I said, okay, I'm joining the AAPRP. So
Follow-up question for you. So the subject of the show is the damaging effects of patriarchy, which is named after a presentation that you developed, that you did for New Mexico chapter, as well as the AAPRP and AAWRU as a whole. And so I want to ask, what specific organizing around patriarchy have you done with it in the AAPRP or externally in the movement?
Well, one of the, again, using the word pivotal, one of the pivotal things we did, and this was in the Oregon chapter, so there wasn't really anything in terms of the party itself besides the AAWRU that really called into question from day to day the patriarchy. And we had assembly meetings. There are things that we've had quarterly, but there were still issues. Men were still leading the voice, even on AAWRU issues. So we're like, what are we going to do? So a group of us in the Oregon chapter from the work of the AAWRU developed in our circle. And in the chapter, the Oregon chapter, we had an anti-patriarchy work group. And I think that work, and so we began to chip away really at what was going on. And there were people like, what do you mean? Like, isn't this like, by nature, shouldn't it be anti-patriarchal? It's like, no, we're seeing in a lot of revolutionary organizations, assaults happen. We're seeing that men are still taking credit for work that marginalized genders have done, that non-men have done. And so these are the things that we need to do. So we took the means of how we're already doing work study, having a work study program, which is to build our analysis around capitalism, around imperialism, around Zionism, around all this other stuff. So why not do the same thing regarding the gender question? And so that is when we developed this anti-patriarchy work study group. And so it's folks who are masculine centered, folks who we have seen practice patriarchy in this group. And it developed into something. And so we've seen other chapters and other circles in this organization do that work and is building. And the other thing, we do have a party-wide anti-patriarchy work group. And with that work we've been doing, and you're on it as well, but the work we've been doing, we've been seeing the shift in gender analysis and how people are even using language. And I think those are two very pivotal things I've seen in this work in terms of externally, day to day, talking about this anti-patriarchy work outside the party, at jobs, at just friends and associates, acquaintances. I think doing that work and being like, okay, here's something to think about. And I also am in the New York City chapter of Black Alliance for Peace, and they have a major anti-patriarchy analysis. So even doing that work as well. So combined with the AAPRP, with BAP, and with other organizations doing this work, it's very powerful. And imagine how we can shift society itself with doing this organizing work. So those are a couple of things.
Right. Thank you so much for shouting out the anti-patriarchy work group in Oregon chapter. It really that experience. And I remember we started it because there kept being abuse. I feel like I was like, why is all that organized? I feel like a series of accountability process. Like, what the hell is going on? And so we started that anti-patriarchy work group as a way to proactively approach the problem instead of constantly responding. Okay, we need an accountability process. this person's like hitting their spouse, or this person's like sexually harassing someone, or this person's being a creeper. Instead of having to constantly react, we developed the Anti-Patriarchy Working Group as a means to like engage in systematic political education around the question, and also as a body where folks could like unlearn that stuff together. So I think I appreciate you calling that out, because it was very pivotal to my understanding of what the struggle against patriarchy has to look like.
Absolutely. It's really important as well to, get to this a little bit later, but understanding that gender is also a social construct. And I think when we come into these organizing spaces, there's still, again, no matter how revolutionary the organizing is or the organization is, it's like, oh, women's role is here, men's role is here. And again, what happens when we think of revolutionaries? They tend to be guys. They tend to be male. So even in that space, reading books by folks who are not men, just changing that. And I feel like, again, it is day-to-day work that does that. It's not just meeting, once every other month or something like that. We have to constantly do this work every day, and we have to do a process of self-criticism, because there may be some, as much as we're doing anti-patriarchy work, there may be some internalized patriarchy we have that we have to go, oh, wait, oh, did I just say, I'm so sorry, what did I say? And we have to humble ourselves to be able to accept that criticism. And I think that's another aspect of that anti-patriarchal work, because capitalism trains us, conditions us, teaches us to individualize our situations, which is what's happening with Cuba as well, and with Haiti. And so even with our whatever perceptions we have around gender, perceptions we have around organizing, it's like, oh, but I've always known it as men and women, and like, what's wrong? Like, why do you need to just go and change things now? And so I think that, whatever internalized struggles that we're having, I think this process is another means proactively to deal with that, to address that.
Thank you so much, Jamilah, for sharing that. And I'm so thankful, the dog's barking right now, that I went to the seminar that you did, because I learned so much of like how to recognize patriarchy more. Because like you mentioned, like being conditioned in it and being always around it, like I'm able to like recognize it more, unpack it as well. And that's so critical. And so I'm so thankful to the working group that you all created, as well as what's happening in Black Alliance for Peace, because I'm definitely a recipient of that knowledge and applying those concepts and being able to like call that out when I see it, as well as work internally on myself. So the next question we have for you is, what is patriarchy and what conditions has patriarchy created in society?
So patriarchy, and I'm going with the direct definition of what I did in the presentation. So it's a system in which males or male-identified people hold primary power and influence through political, religious, economic, and social means. So we see this played out every single day. I think a huge example is Kamala Harris. And, a lot of people saying, well, she's of African descent, she's South Asian, she's a woman, we need to vote for her because she represents all these marginalized groups. And what we're seeing is she's practicing, as per her bosses, imperialism and capitalism. So we can't look at simply being a woman, simply being someone who's not European, as an arbiter of contributing to our liberation. And so when that is dealing with patriarchy, sort of this sort of representational aspect of it, you still, even as a person in a marginalized community, have to represent this individualism, have to represent this stealing of land, have to represent this structure of economic inequities in order to even be seen as representative. And so then another way to see patriarchy in action is, as I mentioned, when we look at activists, when we look at revolutionaries, we tend to think of men as being in the top form. And when you ask people, do you know of any women? It takes a long time for people to even think of one woman, to think of one trans person, to think of one person in marginalized gender that is doing revolutionary work. And we tend to be on the front lines doing it. So it's like, how come we cannot think of that? Another way that you see this happening is looking at, if we're to have the collective ownership of the means of production, who's doing the producing? And again, it's us doing a lot of this work. So we have to call into question, why is that happening? The idea of even, what do you call that, polygamy, that somehow it's natural, this idea that you have to achieve this certain level of financial independence. Like, what does that mean? If Oprah Winfrey, if she is achieving this level of financial stability or whatever, and the rest of us are hungry, what does that mean? But people prop her up to be this, oh, she's our savior, and that doesn't mean anything. So again, we get back to the representation aspect. And I want to mention a quote that Kwame Ture said. So he talked about, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that is my problem. So how are we addressing these issues? How are we addressing Kamala Harris? How are we addressing an Oprah Winfrey if we continue to praise this system of inequity and looking at them as a model to achieve, when we are not, again, collectively owning the means of production? It's still producing this idea that a system that men created is something to achieve. So I think those are some other examples. I'm sure I'll think of some more, but those are the first ones I have in mind. Other examples, you have this idea that you must take a man's last name in order to get any benefits out of that relationship. I saw, where was it? The bastion of anti-trans sentiment, Lipstick Alley. So they actually had a question of, if you weren't with the guy, would you still take his last name? And people were defending taking this dude's last name, whether or not he's toxic. And people were arguing against sisters who were saying, well, why should I take his last name? He's, he's not providing. But so it comes with this idea that men should be the providers, the sole providers. And there's the hypergamy culture, I guess, where men should be the providers and women are here. Again, women are already doing the work. Women are the laborers. Women are the ones going to college and then going out in the labor movement, but not getting credit and getting less pay. So these are things that need to be addressed. It's imperative we address that with this inequity of economics. And people are like, well, it's just different jobs, but look at those jobs. Look at the jobs that women and non-men are getting, where, because of taking care of children. Let's not get that twisted. Majority of people caring for children are not men. So, because it's like, well, you're not able to fully be at your job, you have to take off the, so a lot of caregiving jobs, teaching jobs that are deemed beneath society in one way or another tend to go to non-men. Therefore, the pay is lower. So that's another structure of economic inequities that happen. So those are a few things.
Next question we have for you is, what are strategies that exist to destroy patriarchy and the systems that uphold it, like capitalism and imperialism? Because it's really important to understand that patriarchy is systemic, is capitalism and imperialism. So how can we destroy it?
Well, one of the things is definitely having political education. I think that's one of the strongest means to destroy patriarchy, because that's really one of the ways of addressing the issue of capitalism. And so you have capitalism and the umbrella of patriarchy, the umbrella of Zionism, the umbrella of all of these things that need to be addressed under a work study program. And again, when we have these organizing spaces, those need to be happening internally. So while we do have something that is party-wide, they need to happen in our circles as well, because, you know, we're not all reporting, well, this person's doing this. Like we need to address this, and there are extenuating circumstances which we cannot wait. And so addressing things by the means of political education, understanding that there is no biological basis for gender. When we have that understanding, then we will cease to stop saying that you know, only women can give birth. What about people who do not have ovaries? Does that make them less of a woman? Things like that we need to address. Like if you do not have particular physical functions, which is defined as womanhood. When we look at societies prior to colonialism that didn't have specific gendered roles, there are particular languages in Africa that don't even have gendered languages. You go to the Philippines, you go to many places around the world, there are acknowledged genders outside of men and women. So when we look at that, when we address these issues, and I think that political education would really, really help with that. And I know people go, well, you know, these books, I don't have time, you know, I have my job, da, 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 da. You know, there's audio books if it comes down to it. And also really listening to people, really, yeah, I know that there's dialectical ways to look at lived experiences, that again, times are changing, technology changes. And if, you know, people at this point, because of technology, have come into communities where they're accepted, we need to listen to various communities, and we need to understand the intersections of oppression. And, you know, again, going back to a work study process, but just in the means of looking at the intersections of oppression. So, you know, all of us here may identify as, you know, African women on one level who are working class, but, you know, on some level, some of us may identify as non-binary, some of us may identify as trans, and some of us may identify as such myself as disabled. So, so understanding that and understanding and being sympathetic, I guess, or even empathetic to people's lived experiences, and be able to grow and learn and know that, you know, okay, my experience is not the same as this person. And I think the basic thing it comes down to is, especially if you're doing this work in a revolutionary organization and you're saying, I'm a revolutionary, I'm a revolutionary, I'm a revolutionary, and you are not able to do a self-criticism process and be like, hey, there are people who identify as non-binary, and you're like, whatever, then you can't call yourself a revolutionary at all. And I did want to, because you mentioned Comrade Asada, I did want to say some quotes, because I do think it's pivotal in this subject. Though Asada says, no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. No one is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that the knowledge will help set you free. Also, nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who are oppressing them. And also, one last quote, a revolutionary woman can have no reactionary man. So that is why political education is important. That is why it's important to have an anti-patriarchy program, because we have to deal with reactionary factions in our organizations. And we have to do it with the means of a criticism, self-criticism process.
I like that you read that Asada quote about how a revolutionary woman can't have no reactionary man. That's when my dating life is not dry. But also, but also to the subject of gender roles and how gender is a social construct and how particular forms of social organization and economic systems produce particular gender roles. Like, we have to understand that what we think is like biologically constructed, where like a woman's role is like raising babies and like cooking and like being in the house, like that was a specific construction of capitalism to commodify and devalue reproductive labor and assign it solely to people that they gendered as women. And at the same time, the reason why men are slotted into that provider role is because, again, of the economic system of capitalism that pushed the nuclear family, that said the man had to be on top and the man had to bring him in the bacon. But the problem, especially for African people, is that we glom on to those like capitalist gender roles. But the reality of the situation is that there's like an over 40% unemployment rate, for example, in some major American cities for African men. And that's like a global phenomenon where there's like mass unemployment for African people and for African men in particular. And so you're just like, oh, so this person's supposed to bring in the bacon by himself, but he can't even get a job through no fault of his own. Like oh my God, there's all these like gender wars on Facebook where people who have internalized like capitalist and like white supremacist, quite frankly, constructions of what gender and relationships look like are like, I need this much money for a ring, my wedding has to look like this, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, who, you want to marry an African man? Like, who, how? It's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. It's not gonna work under capitalism, y'all. That's not gonna happen. So I feel like we've been led through a particular path about what relationships look like, what gender roles look like, that has no relationship whatsoever to our material conditions. And also in Africa, you know, a lot of the AAPRP chapters in Africa struggle to retain sisters. And it's not because of any failings of the people recruiting, although certainly contradictions always exist that we can move through and learn from. It's because of the imposition of systemic patriarchy in Africa, a lot of times girls are expected to leave school and go home and help take care of their families. And so they don't get to make it as far as dudes do. And that's why dudes often dominate political life. It's because of those gendered expectations, those gender roles created by capitalism and colonialism. Before that happened, there were many matriarchal societies. There were societies where African women and African girls and African marginalized gender peoples had positions of leadership and positions of education, and that was expected and welcomed. But it was the imposition of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism that made patriarchy in this particular form systemic that changed all of that. So I just wanted to point out how important it is to understand that the gender roles we're dealing with are not creations of Africa or African people.
Yes, and to your point, the contradictions in sort of how people expect women to act out their biological destinies. So there's a whole pro-life thing, anti-abortion, and yet once the child is born, okay, we're only prepping you for the labor movement. We care enough about you when you're in the womb, but you be on the streets, we'll send you to foster care when the system doesn't care about the child. And it's just like, okay, so it cares about people enough to drive a labor force, but not the humanity of those people. And I think that's another issue that does need to be addressed, is how the concern for these gender roles is a direct consequence of being concerned about the labor population, or has produced wealth for the oppressors.
Exactly. I was just going to say that the labor force that doesn't contribute to our well-being, but to capitalist society. And something in this conversation you all are making me think of is after the Civil War, when Africans were getting into the workforce, the people who were easiest able to get work were women, because women were able to be nannies and clean oppressor houses and feed their children with our breast milk. Anyway, and so women were often able to be in the workforce before men because of continued discrimination, right? And so like Onya Sawu, 40% of African men don't necessarily have access to the workforce. And that's not something that they did on their own. It's the conditions the society has created generationally to block people being in the workforce. And so I just thought that that was really important, and I really appreciate that. And we have to unpack that, is really important. And thank you for also, Jamilah, elevating how anti-patriarchy should be part of every revolutionary organization, because it is interwoven and ingrained in our society and in capitalism in all aspects. And when you all were talking about gender roles, we were cop watching yesterday, and I'll talk more about that later. But at the cop watch, Avery said, he was, my son who's 10, was talking about he's there for the fight for the revolution, and a role that he played that day was doing childcare. And that was so beautiful, right? He was being able to hang out with the comrades, 2 of their daughters, and play and do activities, right? And he, you know, was able to see his role was child. He said that. I don't know why, but we were just having a conversation about revolution and how this work is important. And he was naming what his role was that yesterday, right? And so how non-binary people, men can take on that role as well is really important. And I want him to see that he needs to be in every role, right? Because we can share roles. We want shared roles, shared responsibilities. It's a team. We're a team. And the revolution is a collective, massive collective.
The revolution is every single day.
Definitely. And so speaking of that, we talked about destroying, like strategies to destroy, right? In everything that we do. What are some examples of successful anti-patriarchy strategies in revolutionary movements?
Woo! Oh, I know some people might argue with me, but I think even someone like Fred Hampton addressing the contradictions in the Black Panther Party are the little successes that we need, in addressing his own contradictions. I think that is an example, because a lot of people look at the negativity of revolutionary organizations, so we have to look at the little successes. We have to look at the Zapatistas and their model of how they address the patriarchy issue. We have to look at AIM. We have to look at our many revolutionary organizations. We can look at the foundation of the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. And again, there are going to be struggles every day, because we have a system at play. And if we are aiming to be a mass party, we're going to address those contradictions. So I don't want to look at success as being like, well, this thing happened and boom, because again, we're pushing and pulling up against a capitalist society, a society that wants to assure the revolution doesn't happen. Again, we can talk about Cuba. I mean, even Cuba's relationship to gender and the model they're using is just like, okay, and how they recently had natural hair presentations, things like that, where, you know, not only is it addressing the racism that has happened on one level, it's like, okay, we have to address our contradictions, but celebrating women, celebrating non-men. So I think, I know, you know, I'm not saying anybody's doing that here, but I think we're, again, conditioned to look at success as being this be all end all thing, but successes happen every day. It's because revolutions happen every day. So these little things that we're addressing our contradictions, and language is being changed. And like even the fact, like looking dialectically at even how people are talking about socialism now. There was a thing where Joe Biden was saying, you know, I'm a capitalist, but, you know, crony capitalism, whatever, is exploitative. And people are like, no, let me correct that for you. Capitalism, even that conversation, those little successes. Yes, do we look at it in a different way? It's like, no, we need to get rid of this whole system. But the fact that people are talking about it, who may be like, oh, both sides or whatever. You should never be both sides on an issue of liberation. But the fact that people are inching towards a conversation about liberation, I think those successes need to be addressed. And in those successes, we address the contradictions and we move forward. We have progress in that because capitalism is losing. Capitalism knows it's losing, and patriarchy is also losing because there's the conversation in our everyday lives where people are saying non-binary, oh, you know, so I think those things and I even remember, you know, reading what Huey Newton was saying and people go, you know, whatever. And you know, people accused him of being gay or whatever. So even that conversation, that's increasing. And I think I welcome that. I celebrate that because we're going to have more of that. So let's look at the everyday successes and not just this one large something, because I think we're going to have these expectations that are like, oh wow, you know. And then we have Saronia. You had the film of Saronia. So, you know, I think, you know, in Zinga, like we have so many of these successes against imperialism and colonialism. We could talk about Mbuya Nahanda. I mean, like we could spend all day talking about our successes, but I think in our day-to-day lives, we could talk about the little things that we do daily to fight patriarchy, to fight capitalism. And so that's what I welcome for sure.
That makes a lot of sense to look at the everyday successes and the progress that's being made, because especially living in a capitalist society, it can feel like we're never moving forward. It can feel like it's just overwhelming. But if you really do pay attention, if you're in the trenches day to day, then you see what you're talking about is true, that shifts are happening as a result of the political education and organizing work that we're doing. But in terms of like historical examples, I also feel like I just like constantly feel like the struggle against patriarchy is not militant enough. Constantly feel that, and and the reason why I feel that is because it's just quite frankly not. It's oftentimes like falls on the back burner, even if it's like women leading the work, because we've internalized it too. Even if it's like non-men leading the work, because we've internalized it too. So like I feel like looking at historical examples and be like, this is how they approach this in a revolutionary situation is like really instructive to be like, okay, like where can we step up? Like for example, the PIGC and Guinea-Bissau, the women's wing of the PIGC Udamu. Like the entire approach they took to ensuring the leadership of women, the development of women into revolutionaries during the revolutionary struggle in Guinea-Bissau, I feel like extremely instructive. There's a book called Fighting Two Colonialisms that's on our work study reading list, which is incredible. It's about the struggle against Portuguese colonialism and the struggle against patriarchy within the African community in Guinea-Bissau. And it talks about how, like, from the top down, from Amilcar Cabral throughout the organization, they were like, look, women are going to be soldiers. Women are going to be leaders, including young women. You're going to have to do what they say. You're not going to judge them for their relationships. You're not going to judge them based on their appearance. They're going to be in the front, and that's just how it is. And that's the approach they took. And rather than like saying, okay, well, this cultural practice exists or this cultural attitude exists, and we had to like, you know, go slow, they were like, nope, we're not going to be able to win this war unless women have equal leadership. And so we have to make sure that they can like live up to that leadership. We have to make sure this is a space that it creates women revolutionaries, period, without compromise. Like one of my favorite parts of that book is where this young woman and this young man are like arguing about casual sex, and the man is like saying what reactionaries do now, that like casual sex devalues a woman, and so on and so forth. And she's like, look, we're gonna do what we want, and you don't have the right to judge us. And that was within the African revolutionary struggle in an African country, where we're told that we have to be conservative about gender politics, otherwise we'll turn them off. And in this revolutionary struggle, they were like, absolutely not. That is not a basis for you to judge women. And I was like, damn, like she was like uncompromising, and eventually the dude like backed down. And I feel like that's what we have to do. I feel like too often we are liberal about engaging that struggle about what patriarchy actually looks like. We are liberal as hell. And so I think that looking at, you know, history, looking at what actually worked is extremely, extremely important, so that we can assess how we're doing and change course if we need to. Also, the Black Panther Party is majority women, quiet as it's kept. Quiet as it's kept. I just want to say that.
Well, I wanted to say, given that people tend to honor and pay attention to men more, sadly, we could even look at what Thomas Sankara said, that the revolution cannot be won without women. So, hello. And then you have, you know, the ANC, it was just like the year of the woman. And so there are organizations, and I'm glad you mentioned the PIGC. So it does address patriarchy. We need to have political education process, for sure.
Cool. Also, someone's in the comments making the point that patriarchy existed before capitalism. I just want to be very clear. No one on the stream is saying that patriarchy did not exist before capitalism. No one has said that. No one is saying that. What we're saying is that the particular form of patriarchy that exists, that is systemic, is a consequence of capitalism becoming the global economic system. There was certainly patriarchy before, but it did not look like this. Either way, we're going to smash patriarchy, period. Anywho, so we're coming to the close of the interview. We want to thank you so much for joining us and for dropping so much knowledge about patriarchy and about historical examples and current successes. And so last question we have for you is there any parting words you want to share with our listeners, or any campaigns or projects you'd like to point people to learn more about your work?
My goodness. So we are in the Kaji Circle based on the East Coast. We do have a podcast called the Pansula Podcast. And Pansula is actually a dance of resistance in Azania, which is where we got the name from. And it is on Monday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so that is something we do in the midst of this. And I know you mentioned this on your program, so I'm just repeating it. But yeah, and again, check out the work of the AAPRP. You have the website. There's the work with BAP, Black Alliance for Police. Why did I say police? Jeez. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me for that. Black Alliance for Peace. That today they're actually in DC and they're doing solidarity with Haiti. So there's a lot of solidarity work that's happening for Black Alliance for Peace right now. And there's just a ton of collaborations. There's Black Men United. And so we're actually working with them on the question of patriarchy as well. Yeah, so it's a lot of work that we're doing over on the East Coast. And yeah, so no police. So I thank you. I love you. I appreciate you. You know that. And oh my goodness, thank you so much. And I look forward to, whether it's remotely, whether it's in person, listening and working with you and doing this work continually every single day. Forward ever, backwards never.
Thanks so much, Jamilah. See you tonight at the task force meeting against patriarchy.
That's right. That's tonight. I'll talk to you tonight. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you so much.
I love you.
So much knowledge again. I will definitely have to go back and watch this episode because appreciate all the knowledge around patriarchy and our role in deconstructing, unpacking it, and destroying it. Love it, love it, love it. So for the next part of the program, we're going to give you some updates happening. The AAPRP, we have an elder care program. And what we do is on Saturday, we deliver elder care packages to our elders in the community. If you know any elders who are in need of any of those resources, please contact us. We contact them every Thursday, deliver to them on Saturday. And so always making sure we are supporting our African elders. Also, La Raza Unida this Friday, they are July 16th at Pat Hurley Park at the lower loop of the community center at 6:30. They are having a recruitment meeting. What's so important in this show, if you heard of, always we talk about joining an organization. So in that space, you can learn more about joining that work as well. On this Saturday, at 7 p.m., there is a boarding school healing action in the community where members of the community are going to be gathering together to honor the lives of Indigenous children who were lost, who were murdered at the Albuquerque Indian School from 1882 to 1933. It's going to be a healing space that's focused on people coming together. We're going to drop the link in the chats. That's being supported by Fight for Our Lives, as well as Stop Violence Against Native Women. So you can join that space again at Grace Park this Saturday at 7 to 8:30 p.m. Also on July 25th, this is so important as well. Onya Savu had talked in the beginning about World Geo, about what's happening in Cuba. This is a solidarity event on Sunday at 12 p.m. We're meeting at the El Mesquite on San Pedro. It's focused on ending the United Snakes blockade. There's going to be political education, speakers, and community. There's going to be a car caravan bringing awareness about what's happening. Please join us then on July 25th at 12 p.m. Also on that same day, we're going to be in the Pan-African Garden. If you see the pictures, the food is just growing. We got corn and collards and cucumbers and tomatoes and other things. We're going to be planting new. We got 8 or 9 planter boxes where we're going to plant more food. We're going to be using olas. We're using that as our irrigation system. That's African and dope on making the plants grow until we get actually water on in the property. The PE program on that day is going to be about anti-American nationalism. So that's going to be on the 25th. More information to come on that. And also, we are excited on August 1st. You're going to see more information. It's going to focus on Pan-African Women's Day, celebrating women, uplifting women. It's going to be such a great program. We're going to have food. We're going to have community. We're going to have speakers. We're going to have poetry. More information to come on August 1st. And also on July 24th, this is critical what's happening. The water protectors there are doing a fundraiser. We're going to drop the link in the chat so you'll have information on where to go. It's at 6 p.m. It's stop line 3, and the water protectors are protecting the water, land and water against the pipeline that's happening there. And they're doing a fundraiser, a food drive. People can give monetarily, people can bring food or camping information, and make sure that you come to that. And we'll post that in the comments as well. Lastly, there is a call to action that's happening on around Clifton White. So yesterday, I was talking earlier about Cop Watch. So yesterday, we had another person murdered in our community. So an African man was murdered by police, by the feds. There's going to be lots of lies about what happened. And 2 of our community members got there to Cop Watch. Within 2 minutes on scene with his hands up, and he has the First Amendment right to film, right? But remember, in the United Snakes, Africans don't have rights, Indigenous people don't have rights, Chicano people don't have rights. That's just this racist society. Hands up and all, was arrested for assault on a police officer and either obstructing what was happening. No, they weren't doing that. So there's going to be a call to action on that. So Clifton White is out. We're so thankful that he is out. We're thankful to the cop watchers that were there in that space. Our prayers go out to the family. We'll be seeing more on how we can support the family of this unfortunate tragedy. Again, that continuously happens in our community. And so there's a lot happening in Tiwa territory. We got to stay ready for the revolution, always engage in these acts, all these things that are happening. So again, lots of things happening in the next 2 weeks. We'll be posting that in the Facebook. This Saturday also is Albuquerque Mutual Aid is having a food drive for the past year. Almost 16 months. Albuquerque Mutual Aid has been in solidarity with community volunteers united to make sure to be in solidarity, providing food and resources. Over $227,000 of people's have shared and gifted funds to provide and support one another. People have shared time and resources. So there's a food drive this Saturday, again, from 10 to 2, and that information will be posted as well. Exciting. Pan-African Women's Day. We're so excited about this. You want to make sure you register for it. I've registered for it. We're going to post the bit.ly in the chat. There's been flyers circulating. It's going to be 10 a.m. Mountain Time on July 31st. There's going to be dope African speakers, marginalized genders, women speaking in that space. Make sure you're there. I'm so excited. I know I'm registered for it. Make sure you do that. There's also a Jamu's book, A Guide to Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. Things that we talk about on this show all the time. Make sure you grab the book. If you don't have it, you can order it, read it, make it part of your work study. It also talks about starting an organization. Definitely get the book, highly recommended. AAPRP, there are podcasts happening at least 4 or 5 days a week. You can get political education. It's accessible. It's free. So Pencilla, that Jamilah talked about, that's on Mondays at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. You can check that out. Ajamu and Shakira's on 5 p.m. on Sundays. The Revolutionary African Women's is on Saturday, and there's Forward Everett on Spotify. At the end of the show, there's going to be flyers that have all that information on it, on how you can access it, so you can see at the end of the program to check that out. Political education is so important to how we grow, to how we learn, to the way we move, to the way we build revolutionary organizations. So we just thank you all so much for joining us today. What an incredible program for us to talk about patriarchy together and unpack it. We're the All African People's Revolutionary Party. This is Pan-African Weekly News. We come to you live from Tiwa Territory every Thursday, Mountain Standard Time. Join us next week. I believe what we're going to have on the show is information on stopping line 3. So more information about what's happening on the ground. Our comrade CSN and others may be joining us in that space. So we're so excited for that. Read Hood Communists. Oh my gosh. They have 4 or more articles that come out every Thursday. Check it out. You can sign up to be part of the listserv. Read Hood Communists. They've had articles that came out. You can just check them out. You could do that as part of your political education as well. Again, join an organization. This oppression and capitalism will not be stopped until we stop it, because they're not going to, they don't care morally about what happens to us. All they care is about continued oppression. Join an organization. We need you, not on the sidelines. We need you involved in this work. No matter how old you are. I'm trying to get Avery to officially join AAPRP. I keep telling him, you got to read with me, got to read the work study with me. So hopefully he'll be joining officially. We just thank you so much for being with us. Forward ever, backwards never, like Jamilah said. Stay ready for the revolution. Thank you all.
Fidel Castro was a great man, and everyone in the world recognizes that. We have said of Fidel Castro, and it's true, President Secretary says that at any given moment, the best traditions of any people may be represented by all of them, a majority of them, a minority of them, or one of them. And if Fidel Castro is the only human being that represents humanity at its best, humanity will never be diminished one iota. Fidel Castro is a man of great stature and great comprehension. A little island like Cuba. He has himself leaped beyond this island of Cuba. He is known everywhere throughout the world, and he's respected everywhere throughout the world, except by capitalist pigs. Everywhere. America has no right to talk to Cuba. Cuba can teach America so many things. America says that it's one of the richest countries in the world, and even demeans Cuba because it's one of the poorest. Yet the conditions of health of a child in Cuba is better than the conditions of health of any child in America. From the child, that child is born, until it dies, it will have a doctor in its community that will monitor every movement it makes, free of charge. Because Fidel Castro understands that the most important thing in a society is the quantity and quality of the people and their rising level of consciousness that they have, first of all, a responsibility to other Cubans before they have a responsibility to themselves. America is the exact opposite. Doctors to Africa than America and all of Western Europe together have sent. We're not even talking about freedom fighters. When I first went to Africa in the 1960s, I was shocked. Among all the liberation movements, PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, Frelimo, MPLA, among all of them, I found Cuban combatants there, teaching them, even sometimes fighting and dying with them. Fidel Castro, we have to respect him. We are Pan-Africanists, and Fidel Castro is a Pan-Africanist of the highest order. When Angola was bleeding and the racist pigs in South Africa invaded Angola, Fidel Castro sent the sons and daughters of Africa, sent those Cubans there whose bloodstream has Africa tied to it, to go and defend Africa. To go and defend Africa's dignity. Fidel Castro. That's why the African community here, we instinctively love him. When Fidel Castro came to America at the United Nations, he came to live at the Theresa Hotel in Harlem. No other president has ever done that. That's the honor he paid to us. And he paid us that honor because we instinctively supported him. We always instinctively support justice. And we know that Fidel Castro is undergoing a just struggle. A struggle for independence. A struggle to be not under the hegemony of American imperialism like all the other puppets in the Caribbean. When America says jump, they say how high. Fidel Castro is concerned with one thing, making sure that the national resources of his country serve the priority of the well-being of his people. Go to these other countries. They sell whatever they have. As a matter of fact, their leaders are sorry slavery is over. Tourism is properly controlled by the Cuban Communist Party. Properly controlled. I mean, they're making experiments with it, but they themselves are in the position of controlling, and has within a limited aspect, because at this point it's only experiment. Of course, U.S. capitalism is hoping that through this will happen, but it's just a fight always, and you go into a ring, you fight, you're convinced you will win, the enemy is convinced they will win. We will see. But I think the attack here, the political attack, is what I want to speak of. Under this political attack, it appears that because the people in Cuba are poor and they have nothing to eat, that they'll be disgruntled. Vietnam defeated America. Defeated America. And I was in North Vietnam. I had one of the greatest honors of my life. I had lunch with Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam when American planes were bombing North Vietnam. One of the greatest honors of my life. And the Vietnamese who fought America, they fought America, and every Vietnamese soldier had not one bowl of rice a day. That was their ration. And they whooped America. What does not having food have to do with a fight when you're down? Matter of fact, the poorer you are, the more determined you are in the struggle. So if America keeps thinking that because now the Cubans will only have one bowl of rice, the Vietnamese defeated them on one bowl of rice. The Cubans defeat them on half a bowl. Fidel Castro was a great man.
Jamone, bagabone.